Thank you very much, Donal. Our next speaker is Neil Hamilton. Neil Hamilton was born in 1949 and is a practicing barrister specialising in taxation and trusts. Educated at University College of Wales, Aberystwyth and Corpus Christi College, Cambridge. From 1983 to 1997, he was Conservative MP for Tatton and a government whip in Margaret Thatcher's government. He was later a Minister for Trade and Industry and Minister for Deregulation in John Major's government. He was also a member of the EU Council of Ministers responsible for the internal market. Having joined the Anti-Common Market League in 1967, Nigel Farage invited him to join UKIP in 2002. In 2013, he became Deputy Chairman of UKIP and Director of its 2014 European election campaign. In 2016, he was elected a member of the Welsh Parliament and leader of the UKIP group, and, for the purposes of this talk, a founding member of the No Turning Back group. Please welcome Neil Hamilton.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, here we are in Churchill College, the college of our greatest wartime Prime Minister, or at least a college dedicated to his memory, and the repository of the archives of our greatest peacetime Prime Minister ever, in my opinion, Margaret Thatcher. And we're here also in the year of the centenary of her birth, and it's 50 years this year since she became the leader of the opposition. It's also 40 years since the No Turning Back group was founded. It's a footnote in history, of course. I once said this to Dennis Thatcher, that when he said, what do you think your greatest achievement was in politics? And I said, well, I don't bother myself with that sort of soliloquy. I think I'll just be a footnote in history. Which is, I sometimes wish that Margaret was just a footnote in history as well. I don't think he really did. But I was elected a Member of Parliament in 1983, just like Peter Lilly. That was the year in which the Conservatives had a majority of 144. How times have changed. And in 1983, inflation had already been tamed from having been close to 30% in 1979. We were well on the way to taming the trade unions that were responsible for so much industrial mayhem in the 1960s and the 1970s. And of course, we'd had the seminal victory in the Falklands. But just before the Falklands campaign, Margaret Thatcher was actually in quite a perilously dangerous position in the Conservative Party. Unemployment had gone up from 1 million in 1979 to nearly 3 million. And the economic medicine which had been administered, necessary though it was, inevitably had all sorts of side effects at the beginning, which were very unpleasant. And the Conservative Party in Parliament, invertebrates at the best of time, didn't have the spirit to see it through, with their eyes constantly on the opinion polls. And had it not been for the Falklands War, it may well be that the result of the 1979-83 Parliament had been very different in political terms from what it actually turned out to be. There were plenty of people in Parliament, and indeed in the Cabinet, as Peter Lilly reminded us this morning, who were very much opposed to the Thatcher experiment. And so when I was elected with many others in 1983, we were very keen to do all that we could, not just to shore up Margaret Thatcher, she hardly needed that for the majority of 144 in one sense, but also to build upon the achievements which had been so painstakingly achieved in the previous Parliament. And remember that there were such world historical figures as Francis Pym in the cabinet at the time, and he had been Foreign Secretary during the Falklands War, and Margaret left him out of the cabinet after the 1983 election, and so he went off like a bear with a sore head and wrote a book and formed a group called Centre Forward, the purpose of which was to try to turn back the clock from 1983 and to return to the glorious days of Edward Heath. And I kid you not, we laugh at it now, but there were plenty of grandees like Pym in the Tory party in Parliament at the time who had no sympathy whatsoever with the aspirations of people like me, who'd come from a rather different social stratum from him, We were derisively called by Tristan Garrell-Jones, who was the Svengali of the Whip's office and a member of the left-wing blue chip group of MPs, as the garagists and the state agents and other lowlife of that kind. And so these people who came from landed estates and the background that implies had a very supercilious and condescending view of people like us. You know, they had plenty to conserve. They weren't interested in the aspirations of those who wanted to have something to conserve. And that's what Thatcherism ultimately was all about. It was about aspiration, enterprise, initiative, achievement. And so we wanted to put more flesh on the bones of Thatcherism. And there was this blue chip group of Tory MPs, younger versions of Francis Pym, I suppose, in a way, although that perhaps does some of them an injustice. And the like-minded people whom we'd known as candidates and having been active in the Conservative Party for many years, people like Chris Chope, Gerald Howarth, Peter Lilly, and others, naturally coalesced together. But the person who really brought us together in the No Turning Back group, as it subsequently became to be known, was Ralph Harris, Lord Harris of High Cross, who with Arthur Selden had founded the Institute of Economic Affairs way back in the mid-1950s and transformed the intellectual climate of politics in Britain in the subsequent decades. And so the 1983 intake of Tory MPs was really the intellectual product of the Institute of Economic Affairs, all those who had provided the intellectual underpinnings in economics as well as politics and social policy, which went to be the building blocks of Thatcherism. So naturally, we wanted to take the revolution onwards, and that's what the No Turning Back group fundamentally was about. There are lots of Tory grandees who thought that we shouldn't really have any kind of philosophy at all, that philosophy was dangerously foreign or certainly not British and certainly not conservative. So to have some kind of an ideological commitment, if you like, as it was seen to be, was regarded as dangerous and very un-British, which we didn't see it like that at all, because it wasn't a religious crusade for us. We thought our policies worked and the other lots didn't. And the Heath administration between 1970 and 1974 was a spectacular proof of that, if you ever wanted one. That a government which had come into office with very high hopes and indeed so quasi-proto-Thatcherite policies. Some of you may be old enough here to remember Selsdon Man, the Selsdon Park Conference, where Heath, it seemed to us at the time, had moved in the right direction, away from the statist corporatism of the Macmillan years in the 1960s, the consensual politics which we have come to reject. And there were plenty of people who later look back with fondness upon the rejection of all that. So we thought it was rational, of course, to espouse the policies that worked rather than the policies that didn't. So it wasn't really an ideological crusade, so much as a practical crusade to recreate the conditions in which our country could prosper, not in the world, and to create the kind of civil society where people could realize their own aspirations, take their own decisions, and take control of their lives. And this was what the EU referendum was all about in 2016, on take back control. Not just governments taking back control from Brussels, but our motivating spirit was that people should take back control over their own lives from the state. It wasn't going to be any better if you had useless politicians running your lives from Westminster rather than useless technocrats in Brussels. And so we thought that we were in the vanguard of a revolution all those years ago. And so we followed Ralph Harris, who had something called the Repeal Group in the House of Lords, a dozen or so peers, who had it in mind to try to repeal legislation which was unnecessary or regulations which were excessive and so on. And he wanted to have a similar group in the House of Commons to campaign in the same way. So that's what fundamentally brought us together. But But very quickly turned out that we had a bigger task to perform than that, because there were plenty of siren voices in the Tory party that were trying to hold back Margaret Thatcher and trying to moderate in their terms, to consolidate. They thought that we had reached as far as we could go, actually, in change in our country, and we should consolidate our achievements in 1983, and there was no need to take any further risks. And so it appeared to us, newly elected MPs, that the revolution was actually stalling. So despite all its achievements, there was plenty left to do. And if the government wasn't in a position to do that, then the No Turning Back group, as we later called ourselves, came to supply that need. We didn't form overnight, but we very quickly spurred into action. And so actually on the 22nd of November 1983, which was 7 years to the day before Margaret Thatcher was assassinated by the invertebrates, to whom I've already referred, we had our first meeting of our group in the House of Commons. But in addition to wanting to get rid of things like wages councils, in which at that time fixed wages and working conditions for over 11% of the population, tripartite arrangements that dated back to 1909, then we wanted to strike out in perhaps more dangerous territory. We wanted to see a fundamental reform of the welfare state, education and health first and foremost amongst them. This was dangerous territory because the Central Policy Review Staff, the so-called think tank that was established in the Heath era, but Mrs. Thatcher inherited in 1979 in government, had also proposed something along these lines in the early 1980s. And she was rather horrified by this because, as we know, shroud waving about the health service has been a major plank of Labour campaigning against the Conservatives for many decades. But it didn't seem to us that, given the failures and flaws in the nationalised system in health, that we ought to be constrained by those fears at the time. So we tried to find a name for our group from amongst ourselves. Various options were chosen. The radical reactionaries was something that Ralph Harris himself suggested. The privateers, the crusaders, wouldn't be allowed now, of course, because that would offend the Muslim community. And a whole variety of names were suggested, until somebody suggested, I think it was Michael Fallon suggested, we call ourselves the Disciples. Because we were 12 in number. And indeed, we did have a doubting Thomas, because one of our number was Alan Howarth, who was then the MP for Stratford-on-Avon, and he eventually joined the Labour Party. Without any great enthusiasm, we adopted this title, but it had rather a sort of religious connotation, which we thought was inappropriate, so we stopped using it. The title which we ultimately adopted was the No Turning Back group, because we had a lunch with Margaret Thatcher at the Institute of Economic Affairs, where we met every month as a group. And so we discussed with her some ideas on health and education and employment and housing and other issues of that kind. And actually it's all about our revolutionary zeal to get the government off our backs, to get the economy working, get the country working once again, and have something positive to say to move forward to. And so we produced this little pamphlet called No Turning Back in November 1983. And the timing of this was actually just a couple of weeks or so after Francis Pym had launched his Centre Forward group. And so this was a rebuttal, I suppose, to the attempt of the left in the Tory party in Parliament to turn back the clock. And it was at this meeting that Peter Lilly referred to, having stolen my best story, in his remarks this morning, where Eric Forth had said to her when she asked us all for suggestions as to what we could do better. He said, well, given that you seem to have been so very good at appointing people to your cabinet and government generally who don't agree with anything that you want to do, why don't you appoint a few decent members of Parliament to shore up your position? And as Peter said, lo and behold, in due course, most of us did then become ministers. But the other feature of that meeting gave rise to this pamphlet, but also Michael Allison, who was then her parliamentary private secretary, having followed the great Ian Gow, who had been her main link with the backbenches in Parliament and was a brilliant mover and shaker and keeping her in touch with parliamentary opinion. Michael Allison was the exact opposite. He was a very dear man, an evangelical Christian who spent a great deal of his time in private prayer, which is not the best way to keep in touch with the parliamentary party at the best of times. He said, well, who are Margaret's supporters amongst the parliamentary? He didn't know, so we produced a list for him, an annotated list, something the KGB used to do, and gave it to him. And I think as a result of that, we actually changed the complexion of the government over the next 4 or 5 years ago. But this little pamphlet combined, as Tim Aker has put it in a thesis which he's written about the New Turning Back group and the other group in Parliament called the 92 group, which was basically a campaigning group to organise the support for right-wing candidates for the backbench committee elections. He described the No Turning Back group as the proposals of a think tank paper with the propaganda value of political communication. And unlike Francis Pym, whose Centre Forward group called for spending the privatisation receipts on more public spending, on whiz-bang projects like HS2 and so on, no doubt. Our idea was that we should put all the privatisation receipts into cutting taxes, and as a result of which we would create a virtuous spiral, cut taxes, give people incentives to create wealth and to earn income, which could then, as a result of growth in our national income, mean that government debt would shrink as a proportion of it, and then one thing would lead to another, and taxes could go down on the one hand, public spending could actually increase, so you would have the best of both worlds. And our policies were, as were set out this morning in Anthony Boutel's speech on education. What our aim was to even if things were in the public sector, like schools and hospitals and so on, is actually to make them responsive to the needs of their consumers, to school children and their parents on the one hand, patients and others who used various health services on the other. And the way we did this was by creating a kind of internal market inside the National Health Service on the one hand, making hospitals into independent trusts which were self-standing, where the money would follow the patient into the hospital or would follow the child into the school. As a result of doing that, we created a kind of simulacrum of the market even within the public sector. What we would like to have done, of course, in education is move straight away from local authority control to education vouchers, where you give the parents the value the average value of a child's education for them to spend as they saw fit on educational services. But we couldn't do that overnight, so the best thing to do, and this is what attracted Mrs. Thatcher to our plans after a vigorous discussion that Peter referred to, where she beat us all around the head with a handbag to try to get us to focus on things that were practical and not just long-term radicalism. We produced a plan which ultimately found its way into the government legislative programme in the Education Act in 1988, and similarly in Acts on Health in 1990, which fundamentally reconstructed the education system into the one which is still exhibiting these characteristics today, which were taken on by the Blair government with the academy schools, and then the coalition government built on that as well. And the consequence has been that we do have an education system which is significantly more responsive than it could possibly have been had it remained in the kind of monolithic state control that it had previously been. In the case of health, in 1983, there was 17 billion a year spent on the health service, and only 1 billion spent on private healthcare. So it wouldn't have been possible to move straight away, even if that were politically possible, from one system to another. So we had to find a way of moving gradually towards the objective that we wanted to see achieved. And so what happened as a result was we extended choice to everybody who wanted to use these services, inadequate as it might have been compared with the ultimate and desirable objective. But I think we did achieve a very significant amount in that limited period. But we wanted to go even further over a whole range of government policies, not least in the field of deregulation. I myself became the deregulation minister for the whole government eventually in 1992 when John Major appointed me. He didn't quite know what he was doing, I suppose, in a way. In the same way as he appointed me as a member of the EU Council of Ministers, which is a bit like making King Herod the Minister for Children. But, excuse me one second. Because my aim was to go far further than he would ever have contemplated. Right throughout the government, I had plenary powers to go into any department and get them to do an audit of all the regulations for which they're responsible and to produce lists that were candidates for repeal or very significant amendment. The whole carapace of legislation now smothers industry at all levels, and in particular small businesses that don't have the resources to cope with all this compliance legislation, etc. And so I devised a deregulation bill which gave ministers the power to amend primary legislation by means of a statutory instrument. Wouldn't have to go through the elaborate processes of second reading, debates, committee stage, third reading, report stage, then going through the same in the House of Lords, to try to get rid of all the stuff which wasn't going to be hugely controversial, but which, when taken in sum, added enormous weight to the costs of doing business in this country, and indeed living a happy life, actually, because there's regulations at all levels which get in the way of people in their daily lives. Sadly, I was removed from office in 1994 before that bill actually found its way onto the statute book, and nothing was ever done with it in the remaining 3 years. It's still there on the statute book, available to be used as a means of doing a very significant haircutting job for the overweening state that we now have in control of us. So there is an enormous amount left to be done in our domestic policy, and even the things which Labour governments were happy to live with, we wouldn't have been happy to live with indefinitely. It was always work in progress for us under the Thatcher government. She wanted to see an ultimate objective where we were a free and independent nation in the world, but also the individuals who comprise our nation were free and independent themselves and in control of their own lives. It's completely unacceptable that nearly 40% of our incomes are wrested from us every year, even at low levels of income, and spent for us by the state in ways of which we may not approve, and which we could almost certainly do better ourselves in a competitive market. The Conservative Party came a long way under Margaret Thatcher, then it became becalmed, and since then we've had a kind of Sargasso Sea of inertia which has gripped the Conservative Party, which of course is, I suppose, the explanation for where they are today. And they don't seem even to have woken up as yet to why they are where they are and what they need to do in order to recover their situation. But we will probably never see anything quite like Margaret Thatcher ever again. She was a force of nature, and one who I think, without whom we would never have been able to see the transformation of our country that did take place in the 1980s. So, we need to do our best to build upon her legacy. I'll just finish with one final reflection about this, which is that on the night when she decided to resign as Prime Minister, on the 20th of November 1990, we actually had our monthly regular No Turning Back group dinner at the IEA. And somebody came in at about 8 o'clock that evening and said, I just come from number 10, and she's going to resign. We couldn't believe this. So we trooped across to number 10 just to see what we could do to shore her up, which seems, I know, somewhat improbable given the gargantuan figure that she had been over the course of the 11 years that she'd been Prime Minister, having bestridden the world like a colossus. Nobody could believe what was happening, of course, as only days before she'd been at that famous dinner in Paris, looking like Gloriana, Queen Elizabeth I, at a dinner to celebrate the end of the Cold War, that the West had finally won. And yet, here we were just a few days later, and she was being forced out of office. So we went across to number 10 one by one. Anyway, it was the saddest sight that I've ever beheld in my entire life. She did really seem to have had the stuffing completely knocked out of her, because she'd had the cabinet in one by one and asked if they were going to support her in the second ballot for the leadership. I regret to say that it's as a result of my advice that this policy was adopted, because I had said previously, none of them will have the balls to say they're going to vote against you, or very few of them will, and back Heseltine. So if you have them in one by one, then you're much more likely to survive the meeting than if you see them all collectively, where they can shore each other up, safety in numbers. Anyway, much to my surprise, one after one, apart from about 4 or 5 members of the cabinet, they all said she couldn't win. That was the key. Not that they were against her, but that she couldn't win. So by the time we got over there, she had almost certainly made up her own mind. Anyway, many hours later, it was 2 o'clock in the morning, I was the last one left in the bunker, and she said, well, she'd sleep on it and decide in the morning, and she did. Unfortunately, she was not persuaded by our compelling arguments that she should remain. And the rest is history. But we're here today to perpetuate her memory, but more than that, to carry on the fight. Because it's as vitally necessary today as it was 20, 30 and 40 years ago. If we are to see the transformation of our country that we all want, if we are to revive freedom, independence, enterprise, initiative, then it is by following the true path which she opened up to us from 1979. And the No Turning Back group was perhaps just a footnote in history, but it was an important one, because the party in Parliament ultimately, and the House of Commons in particular, is absolutely vital to achieve the legislative objectives which are going to make these changes. And so I'm proud of that footnote in history of which I was a part. And I hope that our pamphlets, which did have an impact in practical terms, they did change the way in which health and education were governed and set up, and they did make significant changes for the better, which the Labour government is now beginning to undo for the first time. The Labour Party having accepted Thatcherism in the way the Tories accepted the socialist changes that took place in the 1940s. And the result has been that our country is very much for the better. But we're honoured to be here today. The Margaret Thatcher Foundation carries on the flame. We are the Vestal Virgins in the temple of Thatcherism, and proud to be so. So thank you very much, Tim, for inviting me.